All right, so tonight we're going to get into some real life horror, the kind that makes you double check your locks. We're talking those, Mr. Nightmare stories, the YouTube deep dives into those true encounters. They're just creepy. And tonight we've got 3 stories lined up that really highlight those feelings of vulnerability and isolation we all experience sometimes. We cranked up to 11. So if you're ready to explore that dark side of the human experience, let's jump right in.
I love that you framed it that way because that's exactly what's so fascinating about these stories, isn't it? They're not about ghosts or demons. They're about the unsettling feeling that something's not quite right. That sense of unease that can creep up on you, even in the most ordinary settings.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we get in our first story tonight, the intruder in the cabin.
Ah, yes. The classic isolated setting. You're already feeling vulnerable, and then you throw in a remote cabin in the woods. Recipe for a sleepless night.
Right. Our narrator in this story is already feeling a bit raw after a fight with their dad. So they decide to sublet this cabin for a bit of peace and quiet. But of course, things don't go quite as planned.
Well, peace and quiet can be its own kind of unsettling sometimes, can't it? Especially when you're alone in an unfamiliar place. It's like your senses are heightened, and every little creak or groan takes on a whole new meaning.
Totally. And in this case, it starts with a disembodied voice saying, "Who's up there?"
Imagine hearing that when you think you're all alone. You'd probably jump out of your skin.
It's that violation of your safe space, right? Suddenly you're not alone anymore. And whatever or whoever's out there knows you're there too.
Exactly. And our narrator tries to rationalize it at first, thinking maybe it came from outside or it's just their imagination. But then they go downstairs to investigate. And the house is completely empty.
Which in a way is almost scarier, right? Because now the unknown has become tangible. It's not just a voice, it's something or someone that was physically present in the house with them, totally. And that unlocked hatch door to the bedroom just adds to that sense of vulnerability. It's like a physical representation of the narrator's emotional state, wide open and exposed.
It's brilliant storytelling, actually. That one detail speaks volumes about the narrator's overall feeling of unease and lack of safety. You can practically feel the tension building.
Oh, absolutely. And then just as they try to relax back in bed, bam, pounding on the bedroom door. Talk about a nightmare.
What do you think goes through someone's mind in that moment? Hearing those relentless pounds, knowing there's nothing but that flimsy hatch door between them and whatever's out there.
I can only imagine the sheer terror. Our narrator is completely frozen, just lying there listening to those terrifying sounds. Eventually, they find the courage to escape, running barefoot through the woods to the nearest neighbor's house. But get this.
This is where it gets really unsettling. The neighbor just watches the narrator through the window, doesn't open the door, doesn't even acknowledge them. It adds this whole other layer of creepiness to the story.
Right, like what's going on with the neighbor? Are they scared? Indifferent? Or maybe even complicit? It's chilling to think about.
It's a classic horror trope. The unreliable bystander. The person who could help but chooses not to, for whatever reason. It leaves you questioning everyone and everything.
So our narrator, even more terrified now, decides to go back to the cabin. They find their phone in the car and start to think maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But as they climb the stairs back to the bedroom, they see him.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Just sitting on their bed, watching TV like he owns the place. Chilling, right? It's the ultimate invasion of privacy.
Totally. But you know what's interesting? In that moment of sheer terror, the narrator actually manages to think clearly. They scream, the intruder turns, and they make a run for it, eventually calling the police. It shows you how powerful adrenaline can be.
Absolutely. It's that fight or flight response kicking in. And thankfully, in this case, it leads to the narrator's escape. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Nope. Not by a long shot. The police investigate, but the intruder is gone. And when they question the landlord, he acts strangely, adding to the mystery. It's like this unsettling feeling just lingers, even after the immediate danger has passed.
And that's the thing about real-life horror, isn't it? It's not always neatly tied up with a bow. There are often more questions than answers. And that lingering sense of unease can be just as disturbing as the event itself.
For sure. And speaking of unsettling encounters, let's move on to our next story. The van on the dirt road. This one is seriously creepy. And it really plays on those fears of isolation and vulnerability, especially in the context of urban legends.
This story is a perfect example of how everyday anxieties can be amplified into something truly terrifying, especially when you're alone at night in a secluded area.
All right, so our narrator is a young woman walking home late from work on a deserted dirt road. Already the scene is set for something ominous, right? It's dark, isolated, and there's no one around. around to help if something goes wrong.
And as if that wasn't enough, a slow-moving van with no lights on suddenly appears. It's a detail that would probably send shivers down anyone's spine. But it's also something many listeners can relate to. How often do we dismiss those little warning signs in our daily lives, telling ourselves it's nothing to worry about?
All the time, right. But in this case, that gut feeling turns out to be justified. The van starts acting erratically, speeding up, then turning its lights off again like it's playing some kind of twisted game with our narrator.
It's classic predatory behavior, designed to intimidate and disorient the victim. It's like a cat toying with a mouse before going in for the kill.
Right. And as the tension builds, our narrator starts walking faster, glancing back to see if she's being followed. And then her worst fears are confirmed. The van turns onto the dirt road behind her.
The chase is on, and you can practically feel the adrenaline pumping through the narrator as she breaks into a full run. The sounds of the van getting closer and closer.
And then bam, gunshot rings out.
Chilling.
Right. It's a sudden escalation of violence that completely shatters the illusion of safety.
It's that moment when the threat becomes real, undeniable, and it plays on our primal fear of being hunted, of being completely at the mercy of someone with malicious intent.
Absolutely. So she dives into the woods, hiding behind a rock, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she hears voices. A man and what sounds like 3 young girls.
And what she overhears is the stuff of nightmares. The man's words, "Whoever finds her doesn't have to drink the blood tonight," are deeply disturbing and leave the listener's imagination to run wild.
Right. What exactly is going on in the woods? Is it a cult? A kidnapping? Something even more sinister? The ambiguity is terrifying.
It's that missing reasons trope, so common in creepypastas and urban legends. It's the idea that sometimes the lack of explanation is scarier than any concrete answer.
Totally. Our narrator huddles behind that rock, paralyzed by fear. Until she hears sirens in the distance, she runs out screaming for help and the police find her. But as they lead her towards their car, she sees it. A gruesome sight. The body of a young woman lying on the ground.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just a game, a story. There are real consequences, real victims.
Exactly. And the police are confused. There's no van in sight. And our narrator is left to recount her terrifying experience. The man, the girls, the chilling words about drinking blood. They take her home. But as she lies in bed, unable to sleep, she sees it again. The same van driving slowly down her street.
It's like a scene out of a horror movie. The monster returning for one final scare.
Right. She quickly jots down the license plate and calls the police. But by the time they arrive, the van is gone. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. The police revealed that the license plate is registered in South Dakota, but they've received reports of a similar van with the same plates from other states.
This element shifts the story from a personal encounter to something much larger, a possible nationwide conspiracy. It taps into our collective fears of the unknown, the things that lurk on the fringes of society, operating under the radar.
It's like an urban legend come to life. And the fact that it's based on a real experience makes it all the more chilling. Our narrator ends up moving away from Indiana, forever haunted by what she experienced, the unanswered questions, the chilling possibility of a widespread network of evil. It leaves a lingering sense of unease. And now, let's shift gears to a seemingly ordinary suburban setting for our final story tonight. The phone calls and the hooded figure. This one takes a different approach to terror, exploring those anxieties we all have, about the unexpected disrupting our daily lives.
It's fascinating how the story uses something as mundane as a late-night phone call to introduce an element of disruption and unease. It reminds us that even in the most familiar and comfortable settings, a sense of dread can creep in and completely shatter our sense of normalcy.
All right, so our narrators in this story are a couple, just enjoying a typical evening at home, getting ready for bed when the phone rings. It's already past 10 p.m., so they're not exactly thrilled to be getting a call at this hour. But little do they know that this seemingly innocent phone call is about to plunge them into a world of confusion and fear.
And it all starts with their neighbor Al acting strangely. He asks if they know the man standing in front of their house, then abruptly hangs up. They look outside, but there's no one there. It's confusing, a little irritating, and maybe even a little bit creepy, but they try to brush it off as a prank.
Because who would want to prank you with something like that?
Right.
Especially your neighbor. It just doesn't make sense.
Right. But then the phone rings again, another unknown number. And when they answer, it's Al again. Even more insistent this time. "Go outside," he says. "There's someone standing outside your house." And then, click, he hangs up again.
Talk about unsettling. So now they're starting to get really creeped out. They go downstairs and look out the window. And this time they see someone. a hooded figure standing at the end of their walkway. They confront the figure, threatening to call the police. But then the phone rings again.
It's like a game of cat and mouse, with each phone call and each glimpse of the hooded figure, ratcheting up the tension and the feeling of dread. It leaves you wondering who's playing the game and what their ultimate goal might be.
And get this, it's Al again, but this time he's acting completely normal, asking what their voicemail is about. The narrator is baffled and explains that Al just called twice about a man outside their house, and Al denies it, saying he hasn't called at all.
And this is where the story takes a truly unsettling turn. We have two conflicting accounts, both seemingly genuine, and no clear explanation for what's happening. It's like a glitch in reality, leaving the listener to question the nature of perception and truth.
Right. It's like, are they going crazy? Is Al gaslighting them? What's actually happening here? To prove they're not making it up, they even put each other on speakerphone, so their spouses can hear both sides of the conversation.
And yet the mystery remains. Everyone is confused and a little scared. Eventually they hang up, but the feeling of unease lingers when the narrator goes back downstairs to check outside one last time. The hooded figure is gone.
Vanished without a trace. It's like the whole thing was a bad dream, but one that leaves them with this nagging sense that something isn't quite right.
And that's the brilliance of this story. It plays on our anxieties about losing control, about not being able to trust our own senses. It's a reminder that even in the seemingly safe haven of our homes, the unexpected can always lurk around the corner, waiting to shatter our sense of normalcy.
Well, that was a wild ride through 3 truly unsettling stories. We've explored the isolation of a remote cabin, the terror of a nighttime chase, and the disorienting fear of gaslighting and the unknown. But we're not done yet. In our next segment, we'll delve deeper into the psychological impact of these encounters and explore what they might reveal about our own anxieties and fears in a world that can often feel unpredictable and unsafe. Stay tuned.
You know, it's interesting how all 3 of these stories, despite their different settings and circumstances, really tap into that primal fear of the unknown.
It's true. Whether it's a shadowy figure in a cabin, a creepy van on a deserted road, or even just a series of unsettling phone calls, there's this underlying sense that something is deeply wrong. But you can't quite put your finger on what it is, and I think that's what makes these stories so effective. They leave you with that lingering feeling of unease, like you're constantly looking over your shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Absolutely. And it's that lack of resolution, those unanswered questions that really get under your skin. Think about the intruder in the cabin. We never find out who he was, why he was there, or what his intentions were. He just disappears into the woods, leaving the narrator and us as listeners with this unsettling feeling that something sinister was at play. But we'll never know the full story.
It's like the story ends. The fear doesn't. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to. We all have those experiences that leave us with a sense of unease, even after the immediate danger has passed. Whether it's a strange encounter on the street, a creepy noise in the night, or even just a bad feeling that we can't shake. Those experiences can stay with us long after the event itself is over.
And it's in those moments, when we're left to grapple with the unknown, that our imaginations can really run wild. We start to fill in the blanks, create our own narratives, to try and make sense of what happened. And often those narratives are far more terrifying than the reality ever could be.
That's so true. Our minds are wired to seek patterns and explanations. And when we're confronted with something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the world, we tend to invent our own explanations, often drawing on our deepest fears and anxieties in the process.
Exactly. And those anxieties are often rooted in very real concerns about our safety and security. The van on the dirt road is a perfect example. It plays on our fears of being stalked, of being followed by someone with malicious intent. And the fact that the story is based on a real experience, and that there have been reports of similar vans in other states, only adds to the sense of unease. It makes you wonder if there really is a network of evil operating in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable.
That's what I find so fascinating about urban legends, and why I think they resonate so deeply with people. They often tap into those very real anxieties we have about the world around us, anxieties about crime, violence, and the breakdown of social order. And they offer us a way to process those anxieties, to give them a shape and a form, even if it's a fictional one.
It's like a collective coping mechanism, a way to share our fears and anxieties with others, and in doing so, maybe lessen their power over us.
Right, there's something cathartic about hearing someone else articulate those fears that we often keep buried deep inside. And I think that's part of what makes Mr. Nightmare's videos so compelling. He's not just telling stories, he's giving voice to those shared anxieties we all have about the world.
And he's doing it in a way that feels authentic and relatable. These aren't polished Hollywood horror stories. They're raw, unfiltered accounts of real experiences, told by the people who lived through them. And that rawness, that authenticity is what makes them so chilling. It's a reminder that these things can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Absolutely. And it's not just the stories themselves that are unsettling, it's also the way they're told. The grainy footage, the eerie music, the hushed tones of the narrator, it all adds to the atmosphere of dread and suspense. It's like you're being drawn into this world of shadows and whispers, where nothing is quite what it seems.
It's a masterclass in creating a sense of unease, a slow burn horror that gets under your skin and stays with you long after you've finished watching.
And speaking of getting under your skin, let's talk about our final story, the phone calls and the hooded figure. This one is interesting because it takes a more psychological approach to horror, exploring those fears of gaslighting and manipulation that can be just as terrifying as any physical threat.
It's a brilliant example of how someone can use seemingly innocuous things like phone calls and vague threats to completely undermine someone's sense of reality and safety. It's psychological torture, plain and simple.
Exactly. And it starts with something as mundane as a late-night phone call. The narrators, a couple just getting ready for bed, receive a call from their neighbor Al, who asks them about a man standing in front of their house. They check, but there's no one there. It's strange, but they try to brush it off as a prank.
But then the phone rings again, and it's Al, again, more insistent this time. He tells them to go outside, that there's someone standing outside their house. And then he hangs up. The repetition, the insistence, it starts to plant a seed of doubt in their minds.
It's like he's deliberately trying to make them question their own perceptions, to make them doubt what they see with their own eyes. And that's what makes gaslighting so insidious and effective. It preys on our need to trust the people around us, especially those we consider friends and neighbors.
Exactly. And in this case, the fact that it's their neighbor doing the gaslighting makes it even more unsettling. It violates that sense of community, that feeling of safety and security that we expect to find in our own neighborhoods.
It's like the foundation of your world is slowly being chipped away, and you're left feeling vulnerable and exposed, not knowing who to trust or what to believe.
And that's exactly the state of mind that the gaslighter wants to create. They want to isolate their victim, make them dependent on the gaslighter for validation and reassurance. It's a form of control and manipulation that can be incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. So our narrators are starting to get really freaked out. They go downstairs and check again, and this time they see someone, a hooded figure standing at the end of their walkway. They confront the figure, but then the phone rings again.
And guess who it is? Al, acting completely normal, asking about their voicemail. He denies ever calling them about a man outside their house. It's a classic gaslighting tactic, denying reality, making the victim question their own memories and sanity.
It's so frustrating. And it makes you wonder, is Al deliberately messing with them? Or is there something else going on here, something we're not privy to?
That's the beauty of the story, the ambiguity. We're left to ponder those questions, to consider the possibility that maybe Al isn't the villain here. Maybe he's a victim too caught up in something he doesn't understand.
It's like the line between victim and perpetrator becomes blurred. And we're left with this unsettling feeling that maybe none of us are truly safe from the darkness that lurks in the corners of our minds and in the shadows of our seemingly ordinary lives.
And that, I think, is the ultimate message of these stories. They remind us that horror doesn't always come in the form of monsters and demons. It can be found in the everyday, in the mundane, in the seemingly harmless interactions we have with the people around us. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves, the ones that live in our minds, feeding on our anxieties and fears.
Well, that was a chilling exploration of the dark side of the human experience. We've delved into the depths of isolation, vulnerability, and the unknown, facing the terrors that lurk in remote cabins, on deserted roads, and even in the comfort of our own homes.
But you know, as unsettling as these stories are, there's also something strangely compelling about them. They force us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the fragility of our perceived safety, and the darkness that can reside within seemingly ordinary people.
It's true. There's almost a perverse pleasure in exploring those dark corners of the human experience and testing the boundaries of our own comfort zones. It's like a safe way to experience fear and anxiety without actually being in danger.
Exactly. It's like watching a horror movie. You know it's not real, but you still get that adrenaline rush, that thrill of fear. And I think, in a way, listening to these real-life horror stories can serve a similar purpose. It allows us to process those fears and anxieties in a controlled environment, to confront them head-on. and maybe even come out the other side feeling a little bit braver.
That's a great point. It's like exposure therapy for the anxieties of everyday life.
Yeah.
Speaking of anxiety,
Right.
one thing that really struck me about these stories was the recurring theme of isolation. Whether it's the narrator in the cabin, the woman on the dirt road, or even the couple in the suburbs, they're all dealing with a sense of being alone, cut off from the support and protection of others.
And I think that feeling of isolation is something that resonates with a lot of people, especially in today's world. We're increasingly connected through technology, yet many of us feel more alone than ever before, and that sense of isolation can make us more vulnerable to fear and anxiety.
Absolutely. When you're alone, it's easier to let those fears and anxieties take over, to spiral into worst-case scenarios, and that's exactly what happens to the narrators of these stories. Their isolation amplifies their fear, making the situation feel even more dangerous and threatening.
And it's not just physical isolation. That can contribute to these feelings of vulnerability. It can also be emotional isolation, a lack of social support, or a feeling of not being heard or understood by the people around you. Think about the narrator in the cabin who had just had a fight with their dad. They were already feeling emotionally vulnerable, and then they were thrust into this isolated environment where their fears and anxieties could run rampant.
Right. It's like their emotional state made them more susceptible to the fear and paranoia. That ultimately led to the terrifying encounter with the intruder. And it makes you wonder, how much of what they experienced was real, and how much was a product of their own heightened anxiety?
It's a question that lingers throughout all of these stories. How much of what we perceive as dangerous is actually real? And how much is a product of our own fears and anxieties? It's a fascinating question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer.
It definitely makes you think about the nature of perception and how our own internal state can shape the way we experience the world around us. But beyond the fear and the isolation, these stories also highlight something incredibly powerful: the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the terrifying situations they faced, each of these narrators found a way to survive, to escape the danger, and to ultimately move on with their lives.
That's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the fear and the horror, but we also need to recognize the strength and courage it takes to face those fears head on and to persevere in the face of adversity.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting to me is how these stories, despite the terror they evoke, can ultimately leave us feeling empowered. By confronting those fears and anxieties, by acknowledging the darkness that exists in the world and within ourselves, we can gain a greater understanding of our own capacity for resilience and strength.
It's like a reminder that we're capable of overcoming even the most challenging and terrifying experiences. And that knowledge can give us the courage to face whatever life throws our way.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these 3 unsettling tales of real-life horror, I'm curious to know what stood out to you the most. Was it the chilling details of the encounters, the exploration of our shared anxieties, or maybe the realization that even in the darkest of times, there's always a glimmer of hope and the potential for resilience?
And perhaps even more importantly, what do you think these stories tell us about the human condition? What do they reveal about our need for connection, our fear of the unknown, and our capacity for both good and evil?
These are questions worth pondering, and I encourage you to continue the conversation on our social media pages. Share your reactions, your chills, your theories. We want to hear it all. And remember, the next time you find yourself feeling vulnerable or alone, recall the strength and resilience of these storytellers. You might just find that you're braver than you think. Until next time, keep exploring the dark corners of the human experience, but maybe leave the lights on tonight.